When I'm dealing with overwhelm, and I think this is really helpful, what I try to do is reduce the number of things I could be doing to a small step. When I come to the page tomorrow, I'm not going to do 95,000 things. I'm not going to write a whole book. I'm just going to write the rest of that line and maybe that whole scene.
When you start writing a novel, it's writing a whole novel, which is huge. It's a massive task. It's going to take you months. But if you think, I'm just going to write a character description, or I'm just going to write the first paragraph, it becomes less onerous and more achievable.
Put a life on the line. Our characters in the story, they change over the course of the story. So they start out one way and they end a different way because what happens in the story affects them as a person. What you really need is for the stakes in the story to be large enough to affect that change on your character. Because if the stakes don't match how your character changes, it's not going to seem authentic. And one of the ways to really raise those stakes is to put a life on the line. Now that can be literal, but it can also be metaphorical. It can be a social death that a character feels. And the sooner we tap into that, the more the reader is continuing to read to find out if they escape death.
I think it is really useful to draw your inspiration from real history and real events. This might seem counterintuitive to fantasy because fantasy is often its own world doing its own thing, but if you look at something like, let's say, Game of Thrones, you can see the strong inspiration from the War of the Roses, from British history, and the way that has shaped how the fantasy world and the fantasy plot works. And the reason that I really recommend doing this, it allows you to ground your world meaningfully in real things. And anything that allows you to ground your world is useful.
Taking a real thing of history, like a really successful, bit of a battle or military campaign, but then adding that fantasy element to it, as in, what if they were vampires? And then imagine how that would play out, as I do in my book 500 years later. How would that have changed things?
Don't do an info dump when you're writing your dialogue. In movies is probably the most obvious place to see this. It'll be information that one character delivers to another character that is so obviously not something they would actually say, but it's information that the screenwriter thinks that the viewer, the reader, needs to have. And so it's, the history of a place or how the heist is going to go down, or, and it just always is so jarring and takes me out of the scene.
Jarring. I think it happens most of all in the openings of novels, which are the hardest thing to write anyway, and they change a lot. We always say don't info dump sort of in big paragraphs, but then sometimes that can lead writers to think, okay, well, I'll use dialogue as exposition, but you have to do it in a really subtle way that feels, natural. Otherwise, yes, it comes across as a kind of big flag of, okay, I'm telling you, the reader, something.
Tropes can get tossed around and they have a bit of a bad reputation. Every single genre has tropes. Romance is just one where we're leaning in heavily into the tropes in terms of marketing, and publishers are really making the most of them, which I think in turn has people sort of talking about them in a negative light. But tropes exist for a reason, and you can make a successful romantasy without leaning into them.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid of them. People are coming to the genre because they expect certain things.
I think it's okay to feel like you're not reinventing the wheel. I think it's all in the execution.
Absolutely.
My first book, Before I Go, when I was working on that, I got really, really stuck. I think I'm sure halfway through. Halfway always seems to be really messy.
Tricky.
Not having done it before, I didn't know, is this normal? All that panic and anxiety really started to sit in. I very vividly remember pushing myself away from the desk, and we had a really messy dead garden at the mailbox.
Yeah.
And I thought, you know what, I'm going to go to Home Depot and I'm going to get flowers. And I went out and I redid the whole little flower section at the mailbox, and it looked beautiful. For half of the time, I was feeling very guilty. But then, as I was working, things started to unravel.
Yes.
And I got a little piece of dialogue, or a little, maybe the chapter could start this way.
Yes.
And that was really the first kind of lesson that I had given myself of like, you can still be working while you're not sitting at the desk. Like your brain is still working on the story.
You really shouldn't be shocked by the ending. You know, the murderer shouldn't be someone who's literally been on the page for about 3 times and we don't know anything about them, or they come in right at the end as a new character. That's super annoying. I don't know how many times where people, you know, they send me their drafts and I'm like, but why is it them? And they're like, oh, because they didn't see it coming. I said, but you will have pitchforks. People will be angry. And readers do get angry. Look at those Amazon reviews. So, you know, people, they aren't shy.
One thing that was said to me years ago, which has stuck with me about endings, is that readers will pretty much forgive you anything except a bad ending. And because that's what they remember, that's what you leave them with.
When I want to create a really nuanced, layered character, I start with myself and some of my own darker impulses. In my first novel, The Care and Feeding of Ravenously Hungry Girls, I wrote a character who had an eating disorder. So I gave her sort of that part of myself. But for her, you know, I amplified it.
And we want that amplification.
Yeah.
And that, you know, all our characters should be pushed and pushed.
Yeah.
I was thinking about Yellowface and how, you know, such a talking point amongst writers and publishing generally, because, you know, who hasn't been horribly jealous of another writer who seems to be getting more attention than them and seems to have this perfect life on Instagram where they just always look gorgeous and they're always kind of eating a croissant while they're writing while you're at home, like in your pajamas and you haven't washed. And I think that idea of stealing someone's manuscript is sort of the dark side of just reading a book and admiring it and thinking, I wish I'd written that.